deep in the autumn of 1862, while an American generation vanished into the freezing mud of Antietam, the locked upper chambers of a New York jewelry house birthed an impossible paradox of gold and diamonds. It was a ceremonial blade forged not to strike, but to seduce, a glittering presentation sword holding the profound hypocrisy of a warring nation within its rose-cut jewels. Welcome back to Whispers of Centuries. I am truly glad you have found your way here tonight. Tell me your city and what time it is where you are. Then get comfortable and let us drift into tonight's story. If you are a regular listener, do not forget to subscribe for more relaxing history. The day is finally over, my friend. Let the rigid muscles in your shoulders soften and sink deep into the mattress beneath you. Feel the cool texture of your pillowcase against your cheek, and let your breathing slow to match the quiet rhythm of the night. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to solve. Just rest here with me, safe and warm in the dark. It is late October 1862. Outside the tall and rain-streaked windows of Broadway, the midnight wind carries the sharp bite of the coming frost. Down on the damp cobblestone streets, discarded evening newspapers flutter into the quiet gutters, their thin pages heavy with the staggering casualty lists of a fractured republic. The city sleeps uneasily, caught between the booming wealth of military supply contracts and the quiet grief of empty homes. Yet, suspended high above that restless street level, the Tiffany and Company workshop exists in absolute unyielding isolation. The atmosphere inside is dense with the dry heat of a cast-iron coal stove and the fragrant metallic tang of molten brass. A master artisan named James sits hunched over a heavy oak workbench, a man completely alone in a sea of long shadows. The amber light of a single glass chimney oil lamp flickers across his worn leather apron and his soot-stained hands. Before him lies a highly classified commission from the wealthy financiers and politicians of the state. He is tasked with assembling the most lavish ceremonial weapon the Union has ever seen. The oak workbench before him is deeply scarred by decades of chiselling and filing, its surface a testament to a lifetime of quiet labour. Tiny flakes of silver and gold dust settle deep into the grooves of the wood, catching the faint lamplight like fallen stars. James runs his calloused thumb over the edge of an imported German steel blade, feeling the perfect, terrifying smoothness of the metal. He listens to the rhythmic ticking of a brass wall clock, a sound that seems to stretch the long hours of the dim night into an eternity. He reaches for a fine needle and a block of pure beeswax, preparing to etch the fragile illusions of glory onto a surface built for destruction. He weighs out ounces of soft gold, slowly sorting through small pouches of flawless diamonds, while the profound silence of the room presses heavily against his tired shoulders. As we stand here together in the warm and flickering shadows of this artisan workshop, watching the lamplight trace the edges of unyielding steel, please remember that this journey is a work of creative historical narrative constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While firmly rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined to provide a deeply immersive auditory experience. The heavy oak door to the workshop is double-locked from the inside, sealing James away from the damp chill of the New York night. Inside this hidden sanctuary, the space is a cocoon of profound uninterrupted quiet, broken only by the steady rhythmic ticking of a brass carriage clock resting on the mantelpiece. In the corner of the room, a cast-iron stove emits the occasional soft, muffled pop of shifting coals. The heat radiates outward in slow, comforting waves, gently fighting back the cold draft that presses persistently against the tall window panes. A gentle rain has begun to fall outside, a continuous soothing tapping against the glass that blurs the distant gaslights of Broadway into soft glowing halos of pale yellow and muted green. It is a profoundly lonely hour, the peaceful time when the vast majority of the world has surrendered to sleep. leaving only the quiet watchman and the solitary craftsman awake in the sprawling, slumbering city. James adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles, pushing them slightly higher on the bridge of his nose with the back of a soot-stained wrist. He leans closer to the heavily scarred surface of the workbench, his breathing slow, deep and measured, his mind entirely focused on the raw materials spread meticulously before him. There is a heavy philosophical weight to the deep silence in this room. He is a man who has spent his entire adult life bending precious metals to his will, spending decades learning how to coax fluid beauty from cold, unyielding stone and rigid steel. Yet tonight, the raw gold resting on his desk feels much heavier than usual. It is not just the physical density of the noble metal, but the invisible silent burden of its ultimate purpose. He gently lifts a solid unshaped block of pure yellow gold, rolling it slowly between his calloused palms. It is astonishingly heavy, soft enough to scratch with a firm thumbnail, comfortably warm to the touch, and entirely indifferent to the suffering taking place hundreds of miles away. This gold was purchased with the immense overflowing profits of wartime commerce. It flows steadily from the deep pockets of northern financiers, wealthy men who sit in leather-upholstered armchairs in private wood-panelled clubs, drinking imported brandy and drawing clean, abstract lines on large paper maps. They have commissioned this magnificent presentation sword not to strike an enemy on a muddy field, but to firmly bind a powerful military general to their own political interests. It is a glittering, silent bribe, an intricate and breathtaking display of wealth and loyalty masquerading as simple patriotism. James understands this unspoken truth perfectly, though he would never voice it aloud. He is the quiet, patient interpreter of their grand ambitions, the silent pair of hands that will expertly shape their political currency into a timeless masterpiece of 19th century artisanship. He sets the block of gold aside on a piece of soft leather and draws a long, calming breath, pulling the familiar, comforting scent of burnt lamp oil and warm brass deep into his lungs. He reaches across the wooden table and carefully unrolls a heavy, protective piece of oiled canvas. Inside the fabric lies the very heart of the ceremonial weapon. It is a bare, unadorned blade of imported Solingen steel. The metal is astonishingly bright, a flawless, sweeping expanse of polished silver that seems to capture and magnify the dim amber lamplight of the workshop. To simply bring this singular piece of steel safely across the turbulent Atlantic Ocean, navigating through tight naval blockades and the dangerous waters of a world consumed by conflict, was a monumental logistical triumph in itself. The ancient, roaring forges of Solingen, hidden away in the deep valleys of Germany, are renowned across the globe for their unparalleled generational mastery of carbon and heat. They produce blades that possess a terrifying, beautiful perfection, a structural integrity that cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world. James runs his rough thumb very gently along the flat side of the blade, purposefully avoiding the razor-sharp edge. The steel is freezing cold against his skin, a shocking, sudden contrast to the warm gold he held just moments before. It carries no emotion, no memory, and no allegiance to any flag. It is simply a masterwork of chemistry and metallurgy, waiting quietly in the dark to be dressed in the hollow, shining symbols of victory. For now it remains entirely blank, a pristine icy mirror reflecting the tired, focused eyes of an artisan. The rain continues to fall in a soft, hushed lullaby over the city roof, wrapping the brick building in a deep cocoon of quiet isolation as James begins to prepare his sharpest etching needles and his fragrant blocks of yellow beeswax. The rain outside softens into a delicate, hushed mist, settling quietly over the slate roofs and towering brick chimneys of New York. Inside the locked and isolated workshop, James strikes a single sulphur match against the rough underside of his wooden desk. The brief, bright flare of yellow light casts sudden, sharp shadows across the room, before settling into a small, steady flame beneath a tiny copper melting pot. He drops a solid block of pure raw beeswax into the warmed copper bowl. As the wax slowly begins to soften and melt, the dry, metallic air of the room is suddenly softened by the rich, warm scent of summer meadows and golden honey, a ghost of sunlight brought indoors to banish the damp midnight chill. If you are finding your eyes growing heavy and your breathing sinking into a slow, peaceful rhythm, know that you can always gently close your eyes and let the sound of my voice carry you the rest of the way. If you enjoy drifting away to these quiet moments in time, you can softly leave a whisper in the comments below or share this space with a friend so that others might find this quiet sanctuary too. But for now, just rest. There is nothing you need to do and nothing you need to worry about. James takes a wide, flat brush made of soft camel hair and dips it carefully into the warm liquid wax. The golden fluid coats the fine bristles completely. With a remarkably steady hand, he sweeps the brush in one long, unbroken motion down the flat surface of the unblemished Solingen steel blade. The hot wax meets the freezing metal and hardens almost instantly, turning from a translucent liquid gold into a cloudy pale yellow crust. He repeats this slow hypnotic motion over and over, turning the blade with infinite care until every inch of the imported metal is completely encased in a smooth protective layer of wax. The terrifying sharpness of the steel is entirely hidden now, trapped beneath a soft, fragrant shell. The Solingen steel beneath his fingertips has a profound, silent history of its own. To achieve such flawless carbon perfection, the iron ore had to be pulled from deep within the cold, damp earth of the German river valleys. It was subjected to the roaring, blinding heat of colossal forges, pounded by massive drop hammers that shook the very ground, and folded repeatedly by generations of quiet men who carried the secret ratios of heat and carbon entirely in their minds and calloused hands. The blade was born in extreme fire and noise, yet it sits here now in absolute reverent silence. It has crossed a turbulent ocean, hidden deep in the dark, swaying cargo hold of a wooden transport ship, passing silently through heavily guarded naval blockades where massive warships patrolled the turbulent grey waves. All of that immense effort, all of that industrial mastery and dangerous transit was undertaken simply so that James could now sit in a quiet room and prepare to gently scar its perfect surface. He sets the wax-coated blade carefully onto a pair of wooden rests, allowing the coating to cool and cure completely. The amber light of the oil lamp reflects dimly off the matte surface of the hardened wax. James reaches into a small wooden drawer and retrieves a set of finely sharpened etching needles. They are tiny, delicate tools resembling the instruments of a skilled surgeon or a master watchmaker rather than a weaponsmith. Their wooden handles are polished smooth from decades of constant use, absorbing the natural oils of his hands until they have become a deep, glowing mahogany brown. He selects the finest needle in the set and brings it close to the flame of the oil lamp, inspecting the tiny, perfectly sharp point. With this minuscule piece of metal, he will begin to scrape away the soft wax, exposing hair-thin lines of the Solingen steel beneath. He will draw the intricate, curling leaves of oak and laurel, the sweeping, majestic wings of the American eagle, and the grand, boastful banners of victory and glory. He will carve a beautiful, elaborate illusion onto the side of a lethal weapon, an irony that is not lost on him as he takes a slow, grounding breath and touches the steel needle to the soft wax for the very first time. The workshop is entirely silent, save for the exceptionally faint, rhythmic scratching of the steel needle moving against the hardened beeswax. James leans incredibly close to the blade, his breathing shallow and steady so as not to disturb the absolute precision of his hands. With each tiny, deliberate stroke, a microscopic ribbon of pale yellow wax curls away, revealing a hair-thin line of brilliant silver steel beneath. He does not rush. He works with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who understands that true perfection demands a complete surrender to time. He is drawing a wreath of thick oak leaves, the ancient and stoic symbol of enduring strength, entwined with the slender branches of laurel, the timeless marker of victory. These are beautiful, comforting shapes, flowing and organic, standing in stark contrast to the rigid, deadly geometry of the blade they adorn. James guides the needle to form the majestic, outstretched wings of an eagle in flight. Every feather is rendered with microscopic care, requiring hundreds of individual, careful scratches. It is a mesmerizing process to witness, the slow and methodical translation of a grand political idea into a physical, undeniable reality. Yet, as he works, a quiet philosophical melancholy settles over his shoulders like a heavy woolen blanket. He knows exactly what must happen next to make these delicate drawings permanent. The exposed lines of pristine Solingen steel cannot simply remain as they are. They must be subjected to a slow, controlled destruction. Once the intricate design is fully traced into the wax, James sets his needle down and turns to a thick glass vial, resting safely on a heavy slate tile at the corner of his workbench. Inside the vial is a clear, heavy liquid, a potent mixture of acids that carries a sharp, biting scent, completely overpowering the sweet fragrance of the beeswax. With a glass dropper, he carefully draws up a small amount of the acidic solution. His hands are flawlessly steady as he guides the dropper over the wax-coated blade. He squeezes the rubber bulb with gentle pressure, allowing a thin, continuous bead of the clear liquid to flow directly into the carved channels of the design. The moment the acid touches the exposed Solingen steel, a profound chemical reaction begins in the quiet room. Tiny, nearly invisible bubbles form along the silver lines, accompanied by a faint ghostly hissing sound that barely registers above the steady ticking of the mantel clock. The acid is quietly eating into the flawless metal. It is biting down into the hardened carbon structure, dissolving the steel and leaving behind deep, permanent scars. James sits perfectly still, watching the liquid work, calculating the precise amount of time required to achieve the perfect depth. He is using a corrosive, destructive force to carve symbols of honor and glory. It is a slow, methodical erosion entirely hidden beneath the beautiful, romanticized shapes of leaves and feathers. There is a quiet irony in this silent process, an irony that James feels deeply in the stillness of the night. Out there in the dark, beyond the locked doors of the workshop and the wet cobblestones of Broadway, the massive machinery of a terrible conflict is slowly eroding the youth and the future of an entire nation. The heavy toll of the war is leaving deep, permanent scars across the land, just as surely as this clear liquid is biting into the polished steel. And yet, here in the warm glow of the oil lamp, the destructive nature of the acid is being carefully harnessed to create something breathtakingly beautiful, a masterpiece designed to entirely mask the ugly, brutal reality of its own origins. Men of immense wealth and power will look upon these perfectly etched oak leaves and feel only a surge of patriotic pride, completely unaware of the corrosive bite required to create them. James simply watches the tiny bubbles form in the dim light, bearing silent witness to the corrosion, counting the slow, heavy seconds in his mind as the perfect metal slowly surrenders to the chemical fire. The precise moment arrives with no fanfare, dictated entirely by the quiet internal clock of the master artisan. James reaches across the scarred wooden workbench and lifts a heavy white ceramic pitcher by its thick handle. The pitcher is filled with cool, clean water drawn hours ago from the deep municipal reservoirs. He positions a wide copper catch basin directly beneath the suspended steel blade. With a slow and deliberate tilt of his wrist, he allows a thick, clear stream of water to pour over the metal. The water cascades over the yellow beeswax, washing away the biting nitric acid and instantly neutralizing the invisible chemical fire. The soft splashing sound of the water against the copper basin fills the quiet room, a refreshing and deeply cleansing ease. that washes away the sharp metallic tension of the etching process. He sets the heavy ceramic pitcher aside and lifts the blade gently from its wooden rests. Stepping closer to the cast-iron coal stove in the corner of the room, he holds the steel near the radiating warmth. Slowly, the hardened crust of yellow beeswax begins to sweat and soften, turning back into a fragrant, yielding paste. James takes a piece of soft, worn cotton, a scrap salvaged from a faded garment that has been washed countless times until it is completely devoid of any stiffness. He presses the cloth against the warm blade and draws it down the length of the metal in one long, smooth, continuous motion. The wax comes away effortlessly, soaking into the dry cotton fabric and leaving behind the bare, newly transformed steel. He wipes the blade again and again, turning the cloth to a clean edge each time, until the imported Solingen steel is absolutely immaculate and gleaming in the low amber light. The physical transformation is striking and permanent. Where there was once only a blank, freezing mirror of polished silver, there is now a complex, frosted landscape of dark grey valleys. The sweeping wings of the American eagle and the sturdy curling edges of the oak leaves are deeply and permanently bitten into the metal. The visual contrast is beautiful and haunting. The smooth, untouched portions of the blade reflect the golden light of the oil lamp, while the etched design absorbs the light, appearing as a soft, matte shadow anchored deep within the unyielding steel. James runs the bare pad of his thumb over the etched surface, closing his tired eyes to focus entirely on the physical sensation. He can feel the tiny, crisp edges of the design, the microscopic drop from the smooth surface into the shallow, textured valleys carved by the acid. It is the tactile sensation of a history being written in real time. The blade is no longer an anonymous piece of foreign metal. It has been claimed, branded with the heavy, complicated symbols of a fractured nation, transformed into an artifact that will carry these quiet, frozen images of glory long after the current conflict has faded into the dust of archives. It feels profoundly different in his hands now, burdened by the grand abstract ideas it has been forced to wear. With the utmost reverence, he carries the finished blade across the room to a long, low table covered in a thick layer of dark green velvet. He lays the cold steel down upon the soft cushioning fabric. The bright silver and dark etching look remarkably beautiful against the deep, rich green background. The blade will rest here, quiet and undisturbed, while James turns his attention to the true centre of the lavish commission. The quiet hours of the night stretch out endlessly before him as he walks back to his workbench and looks at the heavy, dull ingots of silver and pure gold waiting patiently in the shadows. He must now begin the arduous, delicate process of casting the ornate hilt, a task that will require even more heat, even more patience, and an absolute surrender to the slow, demanding art of the master jeweller. The heavy Solingen blade rests in the cool shadows of the velvet table, its new scars hidden in the dim and quiet light. James turns his weary back to it, facing the cast-iron stove that has been his silent, steadfast companion through the deep hours of the long night. He reaches out and slowly opens the heavy iron door of the stove. A sudden, intense wave of dry heat washes over his thick leather apron, glowing with a deep, pulsing orange light that momentarily overpowers the gentle amber of the oil lamp. Deep within the belly of the stove, the coal burns with a quiet, fierce intensity, reduced down to perfectly uniform, glowing embers that radiate a profound, sleeping warmth. He reaches for a pair of long, thick iron tongs, his calloused hands grasping the cool metal securely. He grips a small, bell-shaped graphite crucible resting on the side shelf. Inside this dark, powdery vessel rest pieces of solid silver, heavy and dull, waiting patiently to be broken down and reborn. He places the crucible directly into the glowing center of the red coals. The transformation of silver is a slow, demanding process. It requires immense patience and a watchful eye, for the noble metal must be heated precisely to the point where it completely surrenders its solid form, becoming a mirror-like pool of liquid light. While the deep heat does its slow work, James moves to a heavy wooden casting box filled with fine, dark jeweler sand. The sand is damp, bound together with natural oils, carrying a deep, earthy scent that smells of ancient riverbeds and quiet, shadowed forests. It is a profoundly grounding aroma, cutting straight through the sharp, dry metallic dust of the workshop. He takes a solid brass model of a female figure, the goddess of liberty, beautifully and classically carved with flowing robes and a serene, unwavering face. He presses the heavy brass figure deeply into the dark, yielding sand, packing the damp earth firmly around every delicate fold of her dress and every sweeping strand of her hair. When he carefully lifts the brass model away, a perfect negative impression remains in the soil, an empty ghost of the goddess, waiting to be filled in the dark. By the time the sand mold is perfectly prepared, the silver in the graphite crucible has completely surrendered to the heat. It is no longer a collection of dull, lifeless fragments, but a small, shivering lake of molten metal. James uses the heavy iron tongs to carefully lift the glowing crucible from the deep coals. The radiant heat is intense against his face, but his rough hands remain perfectly steady in the still air. With a single smooth, practiced motion, he pours the heavy liquid silver into the narrow channel of the soft sand mold. The metal flows like heavy, glowing water, filling the empty impression of the goddess in the dark earth. A small, gentle plume of white steam rises from the damp sand, carrying the comforting smell of hot soil and warm metal directly into the quiet room. He sets the empty graphite crucible aside and waits in the stillness. The silver cools quickly in the embrace of the damp earth, losing its bright liquid glow and returning to a heavy, solid state in a matter of quiet minutes. When he finally breaks apart the soft sand mold, the newly cast hilt falls onto his wooden bench with a heavy, deeply satisfying thud. It is rough, covered in dark soot and clinging grains of sand, but beneath the clouded surface lies the intricate, beautiful shape of the goddess of liberty, born from fire and earth in the quiet solitude of the night. As James meticulously reviews his newly cast work, wiping away the dark earth to ensure every detail is perfectly captured in the silver, we too carefully shape these quiet moments of the past for your peaceful rest. Please know that this content was developed with the assistance of advanced AI tools and has been meticulously reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries. All rights reserved. The newly cast silver figure of the Goddess of Liberty rests heavily in the calloused palms of the master artisan. Though she was born from the fierce, glowing heat of the molten crucible just moments ago, the damp jeweler sand has rapidly pulled the fire from her core, leaving the metal cool and startlingly solid. James carries the rough casting back to his scarred oak workbench, the thick leather of his apron brushing softly against the wooden edge. He sits down with a slow, weary exhale, adjusting the glass chimney of his oil lamp to cast a brighter, more focused beam of amber light onto the work surface. The figure is presently covered in a thin, dark skin of oxidation and clinging ash, hiding the true brilliance of the noble metal beneath. He opens a shallow wooden drawer lined with faded felt and selects a set of the finest Swiss needle files. They are delicate instruments, their abrasive surfaces cut with microscopic precision to shape and refine without ever destroying the underlying form. He takes the smallest half-round file and begins to gently draw it along the side of the silver figure, carefully removing the thin seam of excess metal left behind by the two halves of the sand mold. The sound is a quiet, rhythmic rasping, a high and metallic whisper that fills the isolated room. With every careful stroke of the file, tiny particles of pure silver drift down onto the dark leather catch draped across his lap. The silver dust catches the lamplight as it falls, glittering briefly like a miniature, silent snowfall in the warm shadows of the workshop. as James patiently smooths away the rough edges of the unyielding metal, creating beauty through slow and deliberate repetition, I invite you to settle deeper into your own quiet space. If you are finding a sense of peace in these slow hours of solitary craftsmanship, perhaps you might gently subscribe to our channel, allowing these hushed stories of the past to become a familiar, comforting sanctuary for your restful nights. There is no rush, simply a quiet invitation to return whenever you need to step away from the heavy noise of the waking world. The goddess begins to slowly emerge from her rough beginnings. James works his way around the flowing, frozen folds of her classical robes, his file moving with the confident, unbroken rhythm of a man who does not need to consciously think about the movements of his hands. He shapes the delicate curve of her neck and the serene, entirely impassive features of her face. She is the physical embodiment of a grand national ideal, a beautiful allegory meant to inspire and justify the terrible unseen costs of the conflict raging far beyond the city limits. Yet, in the profound solitude of this midnight room, she is simply a piece of shaped metal, entirely blind and deaf to the immense political weight she is destined to carry. She is perfect, untouched by sorrow or the freezing autumn winds, a stark and chilling contrast to the fragile human lives currently sleeping in the thin canvas tents of the frontline military camps. After the steel files have done their exhaustive work, James reaches for a small grey block of natural pumice stone. He dips the porous stone into a shallow copper dish of clean water and begins to rub it firmly over the surface of the silver. The harsh scraping sound of the file is instantly replaced by a soft wet grinding noise. The wet pumice stone gently erases the microscopic scratches left by the files, slowly transforming the matte, cloudy silver into a smooth, deeply luminous surface. The water turns a milky grey with suspended stone and metal dust, dripping slowly from his fingers onto the wooden bench. It is a wet, messy, and profoundly grounding physical task, demanding his absolute presence and leaving no room for wandering thoughts of the war or the wealthy men who commissioned this piece. The goddess grows brighter with every passing minute, a cold and perfect silver phantom taking her final flawless shape in the deep quiet of the fading night. The steady drumming of the rain outside has stopped entirely, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence that wraps around the brick building, holding the artisan and his silent metal companion in a private, suspended world of absolute focus. The profound silence that follows the end of the rain is heavy and complete, pressing softly against the tall glass windows of the workshop. James drops the grey pumice stone back into the shallow copper dish with a muted, hollow clink. He reaches for another square of worn, washed cotton, gently lifting the wet silver goddess from his workbench. He wraps the soft fabric around the metal, pressing firmly into the deep crevices of her sculpted robes to absorb the milky grey water and the remaining dust. As he slowly unwraps the figure, the true beauty of his labour is finally revealed in the quiet light. The silver is no longer dull or cloudy. It possesses a deep, watery brilliance, a cold and flawless lustre that perfectly mirrors the isolated, freezing world sleeping quietly outside his walls. It is a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, beautiful enough to stand entirely on its own. Yet, for the wealthy financiers of New York and the demanding politicians of the capital, simple silver is far too modest. It does not speak loudly enough of their vast wealth or their grand, sweeping power. The serene goddess must be cloaked in the heavy, undeniable warmth of pure gold. James sets the polished silver figure gently onto a clean piece of leather and turns his attention to a large, deep glass vessel sitting in the shadows at the far edge of his workbench. This thick glass vat holds a complex, carefully balanced chemical bath, a marvel of mid-19th century ingenuity. He strikes another sulphur match, filling the immediate air with a brief, sharp tang, and lights a small spirit lamp beneath the heavy glass vessel. The blue flame of the lamp is small and incredibly steady, silently coaxing a gentle warmth into the clear liquid above. From a small velvet-lined wooden box, he retrieves several incredibly thin, fragile sheets of pure yellow gold. They are so thin they are practically weightless, fluttering slightly in the faint, warm drafts rising from the cast-iron stove. With a pair of long, delicate wooden tweezers, James picks up the fragile sheets of gold leaf one by one and lowers them into the warming chemical bath. The liquid welcomes the precious metal, slowly dissolving the solid gold into a rich, heavy solution. The clear water gradually takes on a deep, beautiful amber hue, transforming into a pool of liquid wealth. He watches the slow dissolution with heavy, tired eyes, recognizing the profound metaphor playing out quietly in the glass vessel. Solid things are being broken down, their original forms entirely erased, only to be repurposed for a completely different design. It is the very same alchemy happening to the thousands of young farmers and shopkeepers currently marching in uniform, their individual lives dissolving into the grand, terrible machinery of the Republic. James picks up a length of thin copper wire, binding it securely around the base of the silver goddess. He takes a slow, deep breath, holding the heavy figure above the warm amber bath. The surface of the liquid is perfectly still, reflecting the low glow of the oil lamp like a dark mirror. With infinite care and a steady hand, he slowly submerges the silver hilt into the dissolved gold. The liquid rises silently around her classical features, swallowing the cold silver in a warm, chemical embrace. He secures the copper wire to the edge of the glass vat, connecting it to a small, heavy wooden battery resting on the floor. The process of electroplating is entirely silent and invisible to the naked eye, a quiet miracle of science taking place in the deep hours of the night. There are no heavy hammers, no roaring fires, and no harsh scraping of steel files. There is only the slow, irresistible pull of the electrical current. Silently drawing the dissolved gold out of the warm water and binding it permanently to the surface of the silver goddess. James sits back in his heavy wooden chair, letting out a long, slow sigh. He rubs his calloused hands together, feeling the deeply ingrained metallic dust against his skin, and prepares to wait in the warm, golden shadows of the workshop as the quiet transformation unfolds. There is no need to rush the science of the metal, just as there is no need to rush your own quiet journey into sleep. The hours stretch out, marked only by the hypnotic, rhythmic swing of the brass pendulum inside the carriage clock on the mantelpiece. The electrical current flows silently through the thin copper wire, performing its invisible alchemy in the deep quiet of the workshop. James rests his heavy head in his hands, closing his deeply lined eyes for just a moment. The warmth of the cast-iron stove wraps around his weary shoulders like a thick woolen blanket, a comforting counterweight to the bitter autumn cold that he knows is currently sweeping across the dark, open fields of the fractured Republic. He thinks briefly of the young soldiers, boys no older than his own nephews, sleeping on the hardening earth beneath thin, damp canvas tents. The stark, uncomfortable contrast between their brutal physical reality and the opulent, gilded sanctuary of his isolated workshop is a heavy, invisible burden to carry in the lonely hours of the deep night. When he finally opens his eyes, the heavy brass hands of the clock have moved steadily forward. It is time. He reaches out and gently disconnects the copper wire from the heavy wooden battery resting on the floorboards, breaking the silent circuit of electricity. With infinite care, he grasps the wire and slowly pulls the figure of the goddess upward, lifting her from the warm, amber chemical bath. As the liquid falls away from the metal in heavy, glowing drops, the transformation is revealed to be absolute and breathtaking. The cold, austere silver has been completely consumed and hidden away. In its place is a majestic figure of pure, radiant gold. The soft yellow metal clings perfectly to every sculpted fold of her classical robes and every delicate, impassive curve of her face. She is no longer just a silver casting. She is an idol of immense, undeniable wealth, a glittering symbol of the unending resources flowing through the financial veins of New York. James lowers the golden goddess into a heavy ceramic basin of clean, cool water, washing away the final traces of the chemical residue. The water ripples slightly as the warm metal enters the bath, a soft, natural sound that grounds him back in the physical tasks of his bench. He takes a clean, incredibly soft chamois cloth and begins to gently dry the figure. He must be remarkably careful now. Pure gold is astonishingly soft, far softer than the imported Solingen steel or the silver resting beneath the gilded surface. A clumsy slip of his tired hand, or a careless brush against a harsh steel tool, could easily scratch the flawless surface, leaving a permanent scar on the metal and ruining hours of meticulous, quiet labour. He sets the dried, gleaming goddess onto a small block of dark mahogany wood, securing her gently inside the padded leather jaws of a jeweller vise. The amber light of the oil lamp bathes the gold in a rich, warm glow, throwing deep, dramatic shadows across the intricately carved robes. The hilt is beautiful, undeniably a masterpiece of its time, but it is not yet complete. The state senators and wealthy financiers who commissioned this ceremonial weapon demand a level of luxury that borders on the unfathomable. Simple, pure gold is not enough to secure the political loyalty they seek in the capital. The design calls for a final, terrifyingly expensive layer of extravagance. James reaches into the very back of a deep wooden drawer, his fingers brushing against familiar velvet boxes and smooth leather cases. He retrieves a small, heavy pouch made of dark blue velvet. He slowly unties the braided silk cord and gently tips the contents onto a square of dark, unblemished felt resting on his scarred wooden workbench. A cascade of tiny, brilliant lights tumbles out onto the fabric. These are rose-cut diamonds, well over 100 of them, each one individually selected for its flawless clarity and captivating inner fire. The stones are cut in an antique, traditional style, featuring flat bases and high domed tops covered in tiny triangular facets. They were designed specifically to catch and scatter the low, flickering light of evening candles and parlour oil lamps. They sit gathered together on the dark felt like a cluster of frozen, captured stars, completely indifferent to the human suffering that surrounds the city. James looks at the pile of diamonds, knowing perfectly well that the sheer monetary value resting on this single piece of felt is greater than the combined lifetime wages of an entire regiment of soldiers. It is a profound, dizzying contradiction, wrapped in absolute silence, waiting to be embedded into the golden robes of the goddess. The diamonds rest on the dark felt, tiny fragments of ancient compressed carbon capturing the amber light of the workshop and throwing it back as sharp prismatic shards of cold fire. James takes a deep, slow breath, letting the heavy metallic air of the room fill his lungs before settling back into the quiet rhythm of his work. He reaches for a set of extraordinarily fine steel gravers. These small hand tools feature handles made of smooth, polished cherry wood that fit perfectly into the hollow of his palm. The tips are shaped into microscopic chisels, sharp enough to effortlessly carve through the soft, plated gold without ever slipping or marring the flawless surface. Before he begins setting the stones, he must first carve a precise, tiny bed for each individual diamond along the flowing folds of the golden goddess. It is a terrifyingly delicate operation. He leans intimately close to the hilt, peering through a small jeweller loop clamped firmly over his right eye. The world outside the workshop disappears entirely, narrowing down to a single square inch of warm, gleaming gold. He presses the tip of the steel graver into the metal, applying just enough steady pressure to curl away a minuscule shaving of gold. The sound is incredibly faint, a soft, whispered carving noise that barely rises above the quiet ticking of the carriage clock. If you find comfort in the slow, meticulous focus of this midnight workshop, and if the quiet weight of the past helps to ease the burdens of your present day, please consider gently pressing the subscribe button. By joining our quiet corner at Whispers of Centuries, you ensure that we can continue to share these peaceful, forgotten moments together, night after night, as you drift away into restful sleep. Simply let my voice guide you, and let the gentle work of the artisan carry your thoughts away. James selects the very first rose-cut diamond with a pair of fine needle-tipped tweezers. It is a beautiful, deeply faceted stone, completely colourless and blindingly clear. He lowers it into the tiny carved seat on the hem of the golden dress. It fits perfectly, a testament to his decades of unwavering practice. Yet the stone must be secured. It cannot simply rest in the gold, it must be permanently bound to it. To achieve this, he takes a specialized tool called a beading awl. It is a small steel punch with a tiny concave tip. He presses the tool into the gold immediately adjacent to the diamond, raising a microscopic grain of the yellow metal and gently pushing it over the very edge of the fragile stone. He repeats this tiny, deliberate motion 4 times around the circumference of the diamond, raising 4 perfectly uniform beads of gold that overlap the gem, holding it securely in place forever. The pressure he applies must be absolutely perfect. If he pushes too softly, the diamond will eventually fall away, lost to the dark corners of some carpeted parlour. If he pushes with even a fraction too much force, the hardened steel tool will crush the brittle, ancient stone into worthless white powder, ruining hours of meticulous labour. But his hands do not tremble. They move with the absolute certainty of a master, guided by muscle memory and the profound, unbroken silence of the room. One by one, the diamonds are lifted from the dark felt and embedded into the golden robes. The goddess slowly begins to transform once again. She is no longer just a figure of solid gold. She is becoming a constellation, a glittering, breathtaking mosaic of light and wealth. With every stone that is set, the hilt grows heavier, both in physical weight and in the immense, unspoken political value it represents. The process is painfully slow, requiring James to frequently close his tired eyes and massage the bridge of his nose to ward off the deep, creeping ache of eye strain. Yet he does not stop. The dark night presses against the windows, keeping the bitter reality of the world at bay, while the artisan continues his silent, glittering work. The quiet repetition of the diamond setting process becomes a meditative trance in the heart of the midnight workshop. Each tiny stone lifted from the dark felt by the fine steel tweezers represents a careful, deliberate choice. James places another rose-cut diamond into the golden channel he has carved along the waistline of the goddess. He presses the steel beading awl against the soft gold, raising the microscopic grains to secure the gem. The tiny clicks of the steel tool against the precious metal are the only sounds interrupting the rhythmic breathing of the artisan and the slow ticking of the clock. He has set over 30 stones now, and the hilt of the presentation sword is taking on an ethereal, blinding quality, even in the subdued amber light of the single oil lamp. He pauses, resting his forearms on the edge of the scarred oak workbench. His hands are beginning to ache, a deep, familiar stiffness settling into the joints of his fingers. He slowly opens and closes his hands, feeling the tight pull of the muscles that have spent decades gripping fine tools and wrestling with unyielding metals. The air in the room is growing slightly heavy as the oil in the glass chimney lamp begins to burn low. The flame flickers, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls of the isolated room. James reaches out and carefully turns the small brass dial on the side of the lamp, raising the woven cotton wick just a fraction of an inch to feed the flame. A faint wisp of dark smoke curls into the air, bringing with it the sharp, distinct scent of burning cotton and warm lamp oil, a smell that perfectly defines the long, solitary nights of his profession. With the light steadied, he looks back down at the scattered pool of diamonds resting on the dark felt pad. They are cold, hard fragments of eternity, born deep within the crushing pressure of the earth long before the very concept of a nation or a war ever existed. They have rested in absolute darkness for millennia, only to be unearthed, cut and polished for this specific fleeting moment in human history. They care nothing for the profound grief of the shattered republic, nor for the grand political ambitions of the wealthy men who purchased them. They simply exist to reflect light, a beautiful, indifferent witness to the vanity of the era, the contrast between the timeless permanence of the stones and the fragile, fleeting nature of the soldiers on the battlefield weighs heavily on his mind. He selects the next diamond, holding it up briefly to the lamplight. It flashes with a cold blue inner fire. He lowers it into the golden folds of the dress, burying the ancient stone into the newly cast metal. The goddess is slowly becoming a creature of pure light and unimaginable wealth, a glittering monument to the extravagant hidden side of a terrible conflict. James leans back into the leather jeweler loop, narrowing his focus once again to the millimetre of gold before him, surrendering entirely to the slow, demanding rhythm of his craft. The meticulous pressing of the steel awl into the gold resumes a quiet heartbeat in the silent room. With every stone that finds its resting place, the magnificent hilt grows heavier in his palm. It is a slow accumulation of wealth and power, meticulously built by a solitary man, while the rest of the city sleeps in the damp, freezing darkness. He takes another slow, grounding breath, letting the steady work anchor his thoughts, keeping the vast, chaotic world outside firmly at bay as the deep night marches silently toward the dawn. The final cluster of rose-cut diamonds awaits their permanent home along the delicate, curving arch of the goddess crown. James shifts his weight on the heavy wooden stool, his back popping softly in the quiet room as he adjusts his posture. The deep, aching fatigue of the early morning hours settles firmly into his shoulders, a heavy, invisible cloak woven from hours of absolute concentration. Yet his hands remain entirely steady, governed by a discipline that supersedes mere physical exhaustion. He reaches for the fine steel tweezers, selecting a stone so small it appears as little more than a glint of freezing light against the dark felt. He guides the microscopic diamond into the center of a star, carved into the golden forehead of the figure. The steel beading awl follows, pressing against the soft yellow metal with a calculated, rhythmic force. 4 tiny beads of gold fold over the edges of the stone, locking it away forever. With this final silent movement, the most arduous phase of the commission is complete. James lowers the steel tools to the workbench, letting out a long, slow exhale that gently rustles the dark leather apron resting against his chest. He removes the jeweler loop from his eye, blinking away the blurred, ghosting after-images of magnified gold and scattered light. He reaches for the soft chamois cloth one last time, gently wiping away the invisible oils left by his calloused fingertips. The hilt of the presentation sword is now a masterpiece of overwhelming, terrifying luxury. Over 100 flawless diamonds encrust the golden robes and the crown of the silent goddess. As he slowly turns the heavy piece in the amber light of the oil lamp, the facets of the stones catch the flame, throwing dozens of tiny, prismatic rainbows across the soot-stained walls of the workshop. It is a blinding, beautiful display of immense wealth, a physical manifestation of the immense power concentrated in the hands of the New York financiers. The monetary value resting in his tired palm is entirely unfathomable. Yet to James, it is simply the successful conclusion of a profound technical challenge. He stands up from the workbench, his knees stiff from the long hours of immobility, carrying the glittering golden hilt with the utmost reverence. He crosses the dim room to the long table draped in dark green velvet. There, resting quietly in the shadows, is the imported Solingen steel blade. The contrast between the two pieces is stark and deeply poetic. The blade is cold, aggressive, and marked by the dark, corrosive valleys of the acid etching, wearing its history of fire and destruction in the raw steel. The hilt is warm, radiant, and dripping with the flawless, untouched perfection of precious stones and pure gold. They are the two opposing halves of the same brutal era, preparing to be bound together permanently. James picks up the steel blade by its narrow, unpolished tang, the raw extension of metal designed to be hidden deep within the handle. He carefully aligns the rectangular tang with the hollow channel cast into the base of the golden goddess. The fit must be absolute. There can be no movement, no rattling, and no weakness in the union. He slides the freezing steel into the warm gold. The two metals meet with a soft, scraping whisper, sliding together with the tight, perfect friction that only a master craftsman can achieve. To ensure the bond is permanent, he retrieves a small, leather-headed mallet from a lower drawer. He holds the hilt firmly wrapped in the soft chamois cloth, protecting the diamonds from the shock. With slow measured strikes, he gently taps the heavy pommel of the sword, driving the steel tang deep into its golden sheath. The sound is a dull, muffled thumping, a deeply satisfying rhythm that echoes softly in the isolated room. With every gentle strike, the weapon becomes whole, transforming from a collection of fragmented, raw materials into a singular, monumental artifact of history, resting entirely silent in the quiet dark of the sleeping city. The soft, muffled impacts of the leather mallet fade into the heavy corners of the room, leaving behind a profound and absolute stillness. James lowers the tool to the scarred wooden bench, letting his weary hands fall to his sides. The presentation sword is completely assembled, a singular, breathtaking artifact, born from the quiet marriage of imported German steel, pure gold, and ancient stone. He lifts the completed weapon with both hands, testing the balance. It is perfectly weighted, the heavy, diamond-encrusted golden hilt acting as a flawless counterweight to the long, etched Solingen blade. It feels incredibly substantial, carrying the undeniable physical gravity of a masterpiece and the invisible crushing weight of the fractured era it represents. He carries the finished sword back to the long table, draped in dark green velvet, laying it down with the utmost reverence. The amber light of the oil lamp plays across the frosted grey valleys of the acid-etched eagle, moving seamlessly up to the radiant, warm gold of the goddess, and finally scattering against the cold, clear fire of the rose-cut diamonds. It is a stunning visual contradiction, a beautiful illusion forged in metal and stone. James leaves it resting peacefully in the shadows, turning his tired eyes toward a different corner of the secluded workshop, a space dedicated not to fire and metal, but to the softer, warmer elements of wood and woven fabric. The air in this section of the room carries a vastly different scent. The sharp, dry tang of nitric acid and molten brass is replaced by the deep, rich fragrance of aged timber, sweet beeswax polish, and warm animal hide glue. Resting on a long, clean wooden table is a solid block of Brazilian rosewood. This rare, imported timber has been drying quietly in the dark corners of the shop for over a decade, slowly surrendering its natural moisture to the dry, heated air of countless New York winters. The wood is incredibly dense, possessing a smooth, practically flawless surface even before the final polish is applied. Its grain is a hypnotic, swirling tapestry of dark brown and deep bruised crimson, a natural beauty that easily rivals the complex, man-made etching on the steel blade. James runs his calloused palm slowly over the smooth surface of the rosewood, feeling the comforting, grounding texture of the natural material. He must now construct the scabbard, the protective wooden shell that will house the beautiful blade. He reaches for a pair of heavy iron shears, their large blades dull grey and meticulously oiled. Beside the rosewood lies a bolt of heavy pure silk velvet, dyed a deep, rich shade of midnight blue. The colour is so dark it appears almost black in the low lamplight. A fabric, soft enough to cradle the polished steel without ever scratching the delicate, frosted etching. He carefully measures the length of the scabbard, the heavy iron shears slicing cleanly through the thick velvet with a deeply satisfying, rhythmic sound. The soft, hushed noise of the cutting fabric is a gentle lullaby in the quiet room. He warms a small copper pot of glue over the cast-iron stove, the sweet, earthy scent filling the immediate air. With a flat, stiff-bristled brush, he paints the inside of the hollowed rosewood with the warm adhesive, pressing the midnight blue velvet firmly into the curved channels. He is building a dark, perfectly fitted resting place for the weapon, a quiet sanctuary where the cold steel will spend the vast majority of its existence, hidden away from the muddy reality of the world and the harsh light of day. The warm animal hide glue sets quickly in the dry, heated air of the workshop, binding the heavy midnight blue velvet permanently to the inner walls of the carved Brazilian rosewood. James presses his calloused thumb slowly along the soft interior channel, feeling the plush, yielding pile of the fabric. It is a perfect, seamless lining, a dark and silent cocoon that will protect the acid-etched steel from the corrosive humidity of the outside world. He brings the two carefully carved halves of the rosewood scabbard together, aligning the microscopic wooden pins he has carved to secure the tight joint. The two pieces of ancient timber meet with a soft, hollow click, merging back into a singular, solid length of deeply grained wood. To ensure the bond is absolute and entirely unbreakable, he binds the scabbard tightly in long strips of soft, worn leather, wrapping the wood carefully from the open throat down to the very tip. He leaves the wrapped wood to rest in the warm shadows near the cast-iron stove, allowing the gentle, radiant heat to deeply cure the adhesive. The rhythmic ticking of the brass carriage clock on the mantelpiece measures the slow passage of time as the deep, heavy night begins its slow, inevitable turn toward the early hours of the freezing morning. James uses this quiet interlude to prepare the heavy gold mounts that will decorate and protect the exterior of the wooden scabbard. He returns to his deeply scarred oak workbench, sitting down with a long, weary sigh that rustles the heavy leather apron against his chest. From a small wooden drawer lined with faded felt, he retrieves the cast gold throat, the thick, heavy metal band that will sit at the very top of the scabbard, and the long, elaborately carved drag, the heavy protective tip that will prevent the delicate rosewood from splintering when the weapon is rested upon the stone floors of grand parlours. These gold pieces are exceptionally thick, solid, and incredibly heavy, cast with the same intricate, flowing oak leaf motifs that decorate the Solingen steel blade. He takes a small square of thick, coarse leather, coated in a fine red polishing compound. He begins to rub the leather firmly against the surface of the gold mounts. The repetitive, rhythmic motion fills the room with a soft, swishing sound, a quiet meditation in the fading, solitary hours of the night. With every pass of the coarse leather, the dull, frosted surface of the raw gold is slowly buffed away, revealing a mirror-like, deeply radiant shine. The metal grows remarkably warm beneath his fingers, absorbing the physical friction of his labour. It is a slow, deeply satisfying physical process, watching the dull, quiet elements transform into brilliant, reflective surfaces that capture and magnify the low amber light of the single oil lamp. When the gold mounts are polished to absolute perfection, their surfaces completely devoid of any microscopic scratches, he walks over to the stove and unwraps the leather bindings from the rosewood scabbard. The wooden shell is now a single unified piece, perfectly hollowed and flawlessly lined with the midnight blue velvet. James takes a small folded pad of soft cotton and dips it lightly into a shallow ceramic jar of raw linseed oil and melted beeswax. He rubs the fragrant, earthy mixture into the surface of the Brazilian rosewood. The transformation of the timber is immediate and profound. The dull, dry surface of the wood suddenly springs to life, the deep crimson and dark brown grain darkening and blooming beneath the rich oil. The wood absorbs the polish greedily, taking on a soft, warm satin luster that feels incredibly smooth and comforting to the touch. He carefully slides the heavy gold throat over the top of the polished rosewood, tapping it gently into place with the leather mallet. He repeats the meticulous process with the thick gold drag at the very bottom of the scabbard, securing both pieces with tiny, practically invisible gold pins. The scabbard is now completely finished. It is a stunning, beautifully balanced object, a perfect harmony of dark, swirling ancient timber, radiant yellow gold, and the soft, secret interior of dark velvet. It is a flawless, luxurious resting place for the magnificent hilt and the etched blade, an ornate and beautiful vessel designed to permanently contain and hide the silent, cold threat of the imported Solingen steel. The moment of final assembly has arrived in the deep, undisturbed quiet of the workshop. James stands before the long table draped in dark green velvet, breathing in the rich scent of warm linseed oil and polished rosewood. He reaches out and lifts the magnificent, diamond-encrusted hilt with his right hand, feeling the immense, cold weight of the clustered stones against his palm. With his left hand he firmly grasps the heavy, gold-mounted scabbard. The air in the room feels thick, suspended in a quiet moment of profound completion. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a seasoned craftsman, he guides the tip of the acid-etched Solingen steel blade into the golden throat of the scabbard. As the cold metal slides downward, the midnight blue silk velvet lining gently embraces the frosted steel. The sound is entirely unique, a soft, continuous, and deeply satisfying sigh of metal sliding perfectly against thick woven silk. There is no rattling and there is no loose space. The structural tolerance is absolute. The descending blade pushes the trapped air out of the scabbard ahead of it, until finally the heavy golden base of the hilt meets the gold rim of the scabbard throat with a dull, heavy, and resonant click. The presentation sword is now entirely whole. James holds the complete weapon in his tired, calloused hands, resting the heavy weight across his two extended palms. It is a staggering object to behold, a concentrated accumulation of wealth and artistry that defies simple description. The Brazilian rosewood glows with a dark, blood-red warmth in the amber lamplight, contrasting beautifully with the blinding, icy fire of the rose-cut diamonds and the deep, flawless yellow of the heavy gold mounts. It is flawless, it is meant to be eternal. Yet, as he stares at his own newly born masterpiece, a profound and quiet melancholy settles over his weary shoulders. He is intimately aware of the exact monetary value of the raw materials resting in his hands. He knows that the cost of simply the small cluster of diamonds resting on the crown of the golden goddess would easily purchase a vast, fertile farm in the northern countryside, complete with sturdy stone barns and rolling fields of wheat. The total cost of the entire weapon represents a fortune so vast it is entirely incomprehensible to the average citizen walking the cobblestone streets below. He turns the heavy sword slowly, watching the lamplight run like liquid fire down the polished surface of the rosewood. In the profound silence of the room, he cannot help but think of the young men wrapped in damp, thin wool blankets out in the freezing mud of the southern valleys. While he works in this heated, securely insulated room, coaxing beauty from soft gold and ancient stone, those distant men are clinging to cheap, mass-produced iron muskets. They are shivering in the dark, waiting for a dawn that might bring their final, terrible struggle. The heavy irony of his profession presses firmly against his chest. He has spent the entire night pouring his soul and his decades of skill into a beautiful, glittering lie, a shiny monument designed by wealthy men to distract from the brutal, unglamorous truth of the shattered republic. He is a master of illusion, crafting a romanticized, spotless version of glory for a conflict that is entirely defined by profound loss and cold earth. He is making the very concept of war beautiful, stripping away the harsh reality to leave only the clean abstract symbols of eagles and oak leaves. He sets the heavy weapon gently back down upon the dark green velvet, the plush fabric absorbing the sound entirely. The deep contrast between his quiet, peaceful labour and the violent reality of the era is a ghost that haunts the dim corners of his workspace. a silent truth that he must quietly endure alone as the deep night continues its slow, steady march toward the morning. The heavy air of the workshop begins to cool as the cast-iron stove slowly consumes the last of its dark coal. James walks slowly toward the corner of the isolated room, his heavy leather boots making soft, dull thuds against the worn pine floorboards. He reaches a small, white porcelain washbasin resting on a simple wooden stand. The water inside the heavy pitcher was poured hours ago and is now biting and cold. He lifts the ceramic pitcher, tilting it carefully to let a thick, clear stream of water cascade over his deeply stained hands. The sudden, shocking cold is a stark contrast to the deep, lingering heat of the polishing leather and the melting gold. He rubs a hard block of yellow lye soap between his calloused palms, creating a thick, white lather that smells faintly of rendered fat and sharp lavender. As he works the coarse soap into the deep creases of his skin, the water in the basin begins to turn a cloudy metallic grey, washing away the invisible traces of silver dust, charcoal, and warm animal hide glue. This simple, repetitive act of cleansing is a deeply grounding ritual, a quiet physical separation from the overwhelming grandeur of the weapon he has just birthed into the world. He rinses his hands thoroughly, watching the tiny, glittering specks of lost gold and silver swirl down the porcelain drain, returning to the dark earth beneath the city streets. Drying his hands on a rough, unbleached linen towel, he leans heavily against the wooden washstand and turns his gaze toward the tall glass windows facing Broadway. The thick, dark curtain of the deep night is finally beginning to thin. A faint, almost imperceptible shade of slate grey is slowly bleeding into the eastern sky, subtly diluting the absolute blackness of the midnight hour. The rain has completely ceased, leaving the glass panes streaked with long, drying trails of water that distort the faint yellow glow of the street lamps below. The sprawling city of New York remains locked in a profound, heavy slumber. The cobblestone streets are entirely empty, completely devoid of the clattering wooden carriages and the chaotic, shouting crowds that will flood the avenues in just a few short hours. This fleeting, suspended period between the dark night and the rising dawn is a solitary sanctuary for the master artisan. It is a time when the demands of the wealthy financiers and the crushing weight the national conflict seem temporarily paused, held back by the deep silence of the sleeping world. He walks back toward his scarred oak workbench, pulling a heavy woolen shawl tightly around his weary shoulders to ward off the encroaching chill. He sits down heavily on his wooden stool, picking up a small, smooth piece of dark cherry wood that he keeps simply to hold, letting his clean, rough thumb trace the familiar, worn grooves of the timber. He looks across the room at the presentation sword, resting quietly on the dark green velvet table. In the shifting, pale light of the approaching dawn, the rose-cut diamonds seem to have lost a fraction of their warm, flickering fire, taking on a colder, harder brilliance. The thick gold mounts look heavier, anchored firmly to the dark, blood-red rosewood of the scabbard. The weapon is entirely finished, a flawless execution of a deeply flawed commission. It sits there, a silent, glittering monument to the terrible irony of the age, waiting patiently for the sun to rise and illuminate its terrible beauty. James closes his heavy-lined eyes, surrendering completely to the deep, aching fatigue in his bones. He listens only to the slow, steady swing of the brass pendulum in the carriage clock on the mantelpiece, letting the quiet peace of the fading night wash over his exhausted frame. There are no more metals to melt, no more stones to set, and no more intricate lines to carve into steel. There is only this quiet, empty space between the end of his labour and the beginning of a new day, a peaceful void where he can simply sit, breathe, and exists alongside the magnificent, silent artifact resting in the shadows. The pale, slate-grey light of the approaching morning slowly overtakes the dying amber glow of the glass chimney oil lamp. This new, cold light begins to paint the microscopic particles of dust suspended in the still air of the workshop, turning them into a slow drifting river of silver flakes. James opens his weary eyes, the deep ache in his joints serving as a familiar, heavy reminder of the long night that has finally passed. He rises slowly from the low wooden stool, the thick leather apron shifting heavily against his legs with a soft scraping sound. He walks purposefully toward a tall, imposing cabinet standing in the deepest shadows at the rear of the isolated room. He retrieves a heavy iron key from his apron pocket, the metal cold and solid against his clean skin, and turns it smoothly in the brass lock. The heavy wooden doors swing open with a soft, enduring groan, revealing the final, crucial component of this monumental commission. Resting quietly on the lower shelf is a massive rectangular presentation case. It is constructed from thick, unyielding planks of dark rosewood, polished to a deep, reflective mirror shine that easily rivals the brilliant steel of the Solingen blade. The outer corners of the heavy wooden box are meticulously reinforced with thick, solid brass caps, designed to protect the precious timber from the inevitable harsh impacts of long carriage travel and the rough handling of military aids. James reaches deeply into the cabinet and pulls the heavy case from the shelf, his arms straining slightly under the immense solid weight of the ancient wood and heavy metal. He carries it carefully across the worn pine floorboards, setting it down upon the center of his scarred oak workbench with a deep, resonant thud that vibrates upward through the heavy timber. He runs his clean hands slowly along the smooth, polished surface of the presentation case, feeling the absolute perfection of the invisible joinery. There are no gaps, no sharp edges, and no imperfections, only the continuous, flowing dark grain of the imported wood. He reaches for the two heavy brass clasps mounted at the front of the case. He flips them upward with the pads of his thumbs. They release with two sharp, heavy clicks, a satisfying mechanical sound that cuts cleanly through the quiet morning air. He lifts the thick, heavy lid of the box, the solid brass hinges operating in absolute, perfectly oiled silence, leaning the lid back until it rests securely on its silken tethers. As the heavy lid opens, a rich, trapped pocket of air is released into the cool workshop. It carries the deep, luxurious scent of crushed silk velvet, dry cedar wood, and sweet, natural adhesive. The entire interior of the massive case is lined with the exact same midnight blue silk velvet used to protect the inner walls of the scabbard. However, this velvet is heavily padded with soft cotton, tufted, and meticulously pressed into a deep, precise mold. It forms the exact negative shape of the completed presentation sword, a soft, perfectly contoured cradle designed to hold the heavy gold, the sharp steel, and the fragile diamonds in absolute, unyielding security. There is a profound, quiet sense of finality resting within this empty, velvet-lined space. It is a luxurious, dark sanctuary where the weapon will spend the vast majority of its existence. It will be locked away in the dark, transported across the fractured country on swaying trains, and briefly presented in crowded, gas-lit parlours to the applause of wealthy men, only to be quickly returned to this soft, silent embrace. James takes a clean square of white linen from his drawer and gently wipes the interior of the case, ensuring no microscopic particles of dust have settled into the deep pile of the velvet. He moves with the slow, deliberate reverence of a man preparing a permanent resting place, fully aware that once he places the weapon inside this heavy wooden shell, his intimate connection to the glittering masterpiece will be permanently severed. The pale dawn light, creeping slowly through the tall, rain-streaked windows of Broadway, now fully illuminates the solitary workshop, casting long, cool shadows across the scarred pine floorboards. James turns away from the open, waiting presentation case and walks with slow, measured steps back to the long table draped in dark green velvet. The completed presentation sword rests exactly where he left it, a heavy, glittering contradiction lying peacefully in the quiet, dusty morning air. He reaches down and slides his calloused hands carefully beneath the weapon, one hand supporting the dense, blood-red rosewood of the scabbard, the other cradling the blinding, diamond-encrusted gold of the hilt. As he lifts the unified piece from the table, the sheer, undeniable physical weight of the object demands his absolute respect. It is a dense, concentrated mass of history and extravagant wealth, heavy enough to make the tired muscles in his forearms tremble slightly under the strain. He carries the sword across the quiet room, holding it close to his heavy leather apron, feeling the cold transfer of temperature from the thick gold mounts and the ancient stones. Every step he takes is deliberate and slow, a quiet, reverent procession toward the final resting place he has meticulously prepared. He stands before the open rosewood case resting on his scarred oak workbench. Taking a long, deep breath that fills his lungs with the scent of cedar and silk, he gently lowers the magnificent weapon into the deep, midnight blue velvet. The heavy sword settles into the custom-molded cradle with a soft, yielding sigh, the plush fabric compressing perfectly to absorb the intense weight of the metal and stone. It is an absolutely flawless fit. The golden goddess of liberty rests securely in her dark, cushioned sanctuary, the rose-cut diamonds capturing the cool grey light of the morning and throwing it back as sharp, tiny shards of freezing ice. The deep crimson grain of the scabbard is beautifully framed by the dark blue velvet, a stunning visual harmony that speaks of immense, carefully calculated luxury. James stands completely still for a very long time, his breathing shallow, simply looking down at the finished masterpiece. He has spent the entire lonely night pouring his vast experience, his failing eyesight, and the steady, enduring strength of his hands into this singular object. He knows every microscopic scratch he patiently polished away, every tiny bead of soft gold he raised to hold the diamonds, and the exact, invisible depth of the acid etching hidden beneath the velvet-lined scabbard. The weapon is intimately his, bound to him by hours of silent labour, yet it belongs entirely to a world he will never truly enter. It belongs to the grand gas-lit parlours of Washington, the wealthy financiers in their private wood-panelled clubs, and the abstract, sweeping theatre of national politics. He reaches into the deep pocket of his apron and retrieves a small, heavily braided silk tassel attached to a tiny, polished brass key. He lays the soft silk gently into a small, carved compartment beside the golden hilt, the fabric brushing soundlessly against the velvet. With a slow, heavy exhale that releases the final tension from his shoulders, he reaches for the thick lid of the rosewood case. He pulls it downward, the solid brass hinges operating in perfect, frictionless silence. The heavy timber lid meets the base of the case with a deep, resonant, and incredibly solid thud, sealing the glittering weapon away in absolute, undisturbed darkness. The beautiful, terrifying illusion of glory is now permanently hidden from the world, safely contained within a heavy wooden shell. James presses the pads of his thumbs against the two heavy brass clasps at the front of the box, pushing them downward until they secure the lid with two sharp, satisfying metallic snaps. He inserts the tiny brass key into the center lock, turning it slowly until the internal brass mechanism clicks firmly into place. The Grand Commission is complete. The sword is secured. The long, exhausting vigil of the deep night is finally over. The workshop is profoundly silent once again, save for the steady, reassuring tick of the carriage clock on the mantelpiece as the artisan rests his heavy, soot-stained hands on the cool, polished surface of the locked wooden case, ready to face the quiet breaking of the new day. The solid click of the brass lock echoes briefly in the high corners of the room, signalling the absolute end of the physical labour. James leaves the heavy rosewood case resting securely in the centre of his scarred oak workbench. He takes a step back, allowing his tired eyes to roam over the chaotic remnants of his long night. The workspace is a quiet battlefield of creation. Tiny, practically invisible shavings of pure gold and fine silver dust coat the wooden surface, catching the pale creeping light of the early morning. Dark smears of charcoal and white streaks of dried lye soap stain the edges of the porcelain wash basin. The cast iron stove, which roared with such fierce, blinding heat just a few hours ago, now emits only a faint dying warmth, its belly full of soft grey ash. It is time to restore order to the sanctuary. James reaches for a wide, flat brush made of stiff boar bristles. He begins at the far right edge of the workbench, sweeping the brush in long, deliberate strokes. He gathers the precious metallic dust into a small, neat pile. Even the waste in this room holds immense value. He uses a flat square of stiff leather to scoop the accumulated dust into a small glass vial, sealing it tightly with a cork. This dust will eventually be melted down and refined. Reborn into something entirely new, a cycle of continuous resurrection that offers a strange, quiet comfort to his weary mind. He moves on to the delicate hand tools. The fine steel gravers, their cherry wood handles darkened by the natural oils of his skin, are wiped meticulously with a piece of oiled canvas. He checks each microscopic tip for any sign of dullness, finding none. He places them carefully back into their faded velvet-lined drawer, aligning them perfectly in their designated slots. The small copper melting pot is scrubbed free of the fragrant beeswax, the metal cold and dull once again. Every action is slow, methodical, and deeply familiar. This meticulous cleaning process is a physical meditation, a way to gently lower his mind from the intense, rigid focus of the diamond, setting back down to the ordinary quiet rhythm of the morning. The air in the room begins to lose its heavy metallic sharpness, slowly replaced by the damp, clean smell of the waking city seeping gently through the microscopic gaps in the tall window frames. The isolated magic of the deep night is slowly dissolving into the practical, unyielding reality of the new day, leaving the master artisan alone with his quiet thoughts and his perfectly organized bench. The pale, slate-grey light outside the tall windows slowly softens into a delicate morning blue, carrying with it the undeniable arrival of the waking world. Down below on the damp cobblestone streets of Broadway, the profound silence of the night is finally broken. The rhythmic, muffled clopping of a heavy draft horse pulling a wooden delivery wagon echoes softly up the brick facade of the building. The sound is distant, filtered through the thick glass of the workshop windows. But it is a clear signal. The city is rising, completely unaware of the magnificent, glittering secret. Locked away in the quiet room high above, James stands by the scarred oak workbench, his long night of solitary labour officially concluded. He reaches behind his back and slowly unties the thick leather strings of his heavy work apron. The stiff, soot-stained leather creaks softly as he pulls it over his head. He folds the heavy garment with deliberate care, smoothing his rough hands over the familiar creases, and drapes it over the back of his wooden stool. He rolls down the sleeves of his white cotton shirt, his fingers clumsily navigating the small bone buttons at his wrists. His joints deeply stiff from hours of gripping steel gravers and heavy jeweller hammers. He walks over to a tarnished brass hook near the heavy oak door and retrieves his long, heavy wool coat. As he slips his tired arms into the thick sleeves, the familiar scent of damp wool and cold city air surrounds him, a comforting, ordinary smell that gently grounds him back in the mundane reality of his daily life. He fastens the dark horn buttons one by one, pulling the warm collar up around his neck to ward off the encroaching chill of the unheated hallway awaiting him outside. Before he turns to leave, he pauses and looks back across the dim, quiet room. The heavy rosewood presentation case sits squarely in the centre of the clean workbench, a dark, solid rectangle absorbing the pale morning light. Inside that locked wooden shell, wrapped tightly in midnight blue velvet, the golden goddess and her 100 flawless diamonds rest in absolute pitch-black darkness. They will remain there, cold and unseen until the grand political theatre requires their blinding light. James shakes his head slowly, letting out a quiet, tired breath. He grasps the brass knob of the heavy oak door, stepping out into the cold hallway, leaving the quiet ghosts of his midnight labour behind. The heavy oak door closes with a solid, echoing thud, sealing the empty workshop in absolute solitude. The brass key turns in the exterior lock, and James walks away, his heavy footsteps fading down the long wooden corridor. Inside the room, the pale morning light slowly illuminates the floating motes of dust, casting a cold, grey wash over the scarred workbench. In the exact centre of this quiet space rests the dark rosewood case. It sits there like a silent, impenetrable vault, completely indifferent to the sunrise and the shifting shadows. Inside the locked box, the darkness is absolute and unyielding. The thick midnight blue silk velvet absorbs any faint vibration from the waking city below. The golden goddess of liberty, encrusted with over 100 flawless rose-cut diamonds, lies frozen in this pitch-black void. Without the warm amber glow of the oil lamp or the soft flicker of parlour candles, the ancient stones have no light to capture or reflect. They are reduced back to cold, hard fragments of ancient carbon, sleeping silently in the dark. The imported Solingen steel blade, hidden within the deep crimson grain of the rosewood scabbard, rests comfortably in its velvet cradle. The corrosive, acid-etched eagles and sweeping oak leaves are entirely blind, locked away from the very world they were designed to inspire and manipulate. Hours pass in this suspended state of quiet perfection. Eventually the heavy oak door opens once again. The muffled, chaotic sounds of the bustling New York morning spill briefly into the isolated room. Men dressed in thick wool suits and dark leather gloves step onto the worn pine floorboards. They do not speak of the intricate artistry or the long, grueling night of solitary labour. They simply assess the heavy rosewood case, checking the solid brass clasps and the secure centre lock. With crisp, efficient movements, they lift the heavy box from the scarred workbench. The presentation sword is carried away from the quiet sanctuary of its creation. It descends the narrow wooden stairs and steps out into the freezing, chaotic air of Broadway, loaded carefully into the cushioned interior of a waiting carriage. The long, silent journey toward the grand political theatre of a fractured republic has officially begun, leaving the master artisan to his well-earned rest. The enclosed carriage lurches forward, its heavy wooden wheels grinding against the wet, uneven cobblestones of lower Manhattan. Inside the cramped and shadowed cabin, the air smells of damp wool, oiled leather, and the sharp bite of a fading autumn fog. The rosewood presentation case rests securely on the plush, tufted seat, flanked by two quiet men who stare blankly at the passing grey blur of the city through rain-speckled glass. As the iron-rimmed wheels navigate the deep ruts of the busy street, a constant, dull vibration travels upward through the floorboards of the carriage. It passes through the heavy leather seats and into the solid brass corners of the rosewood box. Yet, deep inside the locked case, the midnight blue silk velvet performs its silent, protective duty perfectly. The thick, custom-moulded cotton and woven silk absorb every harsh jolt and sudden sway, ensuring that the golden goddess and her 100 fragile diamonds remain suspended in absolute, undisturbed stillness. The loud, chaotic reality of 1862 New York surrounds them. The shouts of merchants, the clatter of horse hooves, and the thick, choking smoke of industrial chimneys. But the sword knows nothing of this noise. It slumbers in its dark, velvet-lined vault, an isolated artifact of immense wealth cutting through a city burdened by a distant, brutal conflict. Soon, the carriage arrives at the sprawling, soot-stained rail station. The heavy case is carefully transferred from the leather seat into the private, wood-panelled car of a southbound train. The transition is smooth and entirely unremarkable to the casual observer. No one standing on the crowded, steam-filled platform has any idea that a fortune in pure gold and Solingen steel is passing right in front of them. The thick doors of the train car close with a heavy, metallic slide, shutting out the freezing wind and the noise of the platform. The deep, rhythmic chugging of the massive steam engine slowly begins to build, preparing to carry the silent weapon away from the northern financiers and down toward the grand, gas-lit parlours of the capital. The rhythmic, heavy clacking of iron wheels against solid steel tracks becomes the new heartbeat of the long journey south. Inside the private, securely locked train car, the atmosphere is profoundly warm and completely insulated from the freezing autumn air rushing past the heavy glass windows. The walls of the cabin are panelled in dark, deeply varnished mahogany that gently reflects the low, steady light of small, gimbaled brass oil lamps mounted to the wooden bulkheads. As the massive steam engine pulls the train steadily forward, a deep, continuous vibration hums through the thick timber floorboards, a relentless reminder of the immense industrial power propelling the fractured nation. Yet, resting upon a thick woolen blanket draped over a sturdy oak table, the dark rosewood presentation case remains entirely undisturbed. The solid brass corners of the heavy box gleam quietly in the dim, swaying light, catching the slow pendular movement of the oil lamps above. Inside the locked case, the midnight blue silk velvet once again proves its quiet, flawless worth. It cradles the heavy gold and the etched Solingen steel with absolute perfection, swallowing the harsh mechanical vibrations of the iron tracks before they can ever reach the delicate, rose-cut diamonds resting on the crown of the sleeping goddess. The weapon travels in a state of suspended animation, perfectly preserved in its dark, luxurious void. Beyond the thick frost-rimmed windows of the private car, the stark landscape of the American eastern seaboard slowly rolls past. The dense, sprawling brick buildings of the northern cities gradually give way to open, freezing fields and dark, quiet lines of barren timber. The sky above turns a deep bruised shade of indigo as the early evening slowly approaches. Out there in the biting wind, the reality of the era is cold and deeply unforgiving. Young men are huddled around small, smoky campfires in the distant valleys, their thin canvas coats offering very little protection against the creeping frost that hardens the muddy earth beneath their boots. Inside the polished mahogany train car, however, there is only the lingering scent of expensive tobacco rolled into the plush leather upholstery and the gentle, lulling motion of the heavy suspension. The presentation sword is moving inexorably closer to the political epicenter of the conflict, carried ever southward toward the grand white stone columns of the capital city. It is a brilliant, glittering paradox sliding smoothly through the darkening, war-torn countryside, a pristine artifact of profound political influence, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment it will finally be brought out of the silent dark and into the blinding, warm light of the parlour chandeliers. The heavy iron brakes of the steam locomotive compress with a long, drawn-out sigh of heated metal, a slow release of pressure that signals the end of the southward journey. Plumes of thick, white steam billow across the cold brick platform of the capital station, briefly obscuring the grand gas-lit arches overhead. The thick doors of the private mahogany train car slide open, inviting the sharp, frigid air of Washington into the warm cabin. The rosewood case is lifted once more, carried by gloved hands out of the quiet, swaying isolation and into the bustling political heart of the Republic. The air in this city feels distinctly different from the heavy, industrial weight of New York. It carries the scent of damp marble, burning coal, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco drifting from the long woolen coats of passing politicians. The heavy case is placed gently onto the tufted leather seat of a waiting carriage. As the carriage moves smoothly through the wide, dark avenues, the yellow glow of the street lamp sweeps rhythmically across the solid brass corners of the locked box. These brief, passing flashes of light mark the slow progression toward a grand, sprawling mansion in the center of the district. Inside the dark void of the velvet-lined box, the golden goddess remains perfectly still. She does not know that she is about to enter the precise theater she was created for. The carriage eventually rolls to a smooth, quiet halt before a towering residence, its tall, arched windows glowing with the brilliant warmth of countless burning beeswax candles. The heavy presentation case is carried up wide stone steps and through a massive set of double mahogany doors, crossing the threshold into a world of carefully curated opulence. The atmosphere inside the mansion is deeply insulated and warm, thick with the scent of polished wood, expensive imported perfumes, and the soft, continuous hum of quiet. Powerful voices echoing from the main parlor. The case is carried into a private study, a secluded room lined with towering bookshelves and heavy, sound-absorbing velvet drapes. It is set down upon a massive leather-topped desk with a soft, authoritative thud. The long journey is finally over. The glittering artifact has arrived at its destination, waiting only for the turn of a tiny brass key to finally reveal its blinding, quiet perfection to the wealthy architects of the era. The private study is a sanctuary of profound quiet, wrapped in the rich, earthy aromas of aged leather bindings, ancient paper, and fading cigar smoke. Beyond the heavy, closed mahogany doors, the muffled sounds of a grand evening reception drift faintly through the thick wood. The gentle rhythmic clinking of fine crystal glasses and the low rolling murmur of powerful men form a distant, soothing hum. But inside this secluded room, the only sound is the slow, rhythmic ticking of a tall grandfather clock standing watch in the deep shadows of the corner. The heavy rosewood presentation case rests exactly where it was placed, anchored to the center of a massive green leather-topped desk. The warm, flickering light of a silver candelabra dances slowly across the polished surface of the wood, bringing the deep, blood-red grain to life in the quiet room. A solitary figure steps slowly into the amber light, a man with heavy shoulders and a face deeply lined by the unimaginable pressures of a fractured, weary nation. He reaches out, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulls the tiny brass key from the pocket of his dark wool waistcoat. He inserts the key into the center lock of the rosewood case. The microscopic internal brass mechanisms engage with a soft metallic click, a sound that feels disproportionately profound in the heavy silence of the study. He rests his thumbs against the two solid brass clasps, pressing them gently downward. They release with two sharp, satisfying snaps. With a slow, steady inhale, he lifts the thick wooden lid, the heavy brass hinges operating in absolute, frictionless perfection. The darkness of the velvet vault is instantly and beautifully broken. The warm golden light of the beeswax candles pours into the midnight blue silk, washing slowly over the hidden masterpiece. The golden goddess of liberty emerges from her quiet slumber, her classical features glowing with a warm, radiant heat. The 100 rose-cut diamonds, resting silently in their tiny hand-raised beds of pure gold, suddenly catch the flickering candlelight. They throw a dazzling, prismatic spray of cold fire across the dark wood-panelled walls of the study, a breathtaking display of raw, concentrated wealth that commands absolute silence from the man standing before it. The general stands absolutely still, his breathing shallow in the quiet warmth of the private study. He is a man accustomed to the heavy utilitarian grip of a standard cavalry saber, a weapon born of forged iron and wrapped in coarse, sweat-stained leather. The magnificent object resting in the velvet before him belongs to an entirely different world. He slowly reaches out, his weathered hand hovering over the blinding array of rose-cut diamonds. The flickering candlelight reflects perfectly in his dark, tired eyes as he gently rests his bare palm against the heavy golden hilt of the goddess. The pure gold is surprisingly warm to the touch, having absorbed the ambient heat of the beeswax candles. while the ancient diamonds remain entirely cold and smooth against his calloused skin. With a slow, deliberate motion, he grips the hilt and lifts the unified presentation sword from its custom-molded cradle. The midnight blue silk velvet releases the heavy metal with a soft, yielding whisper. The sheer, staggering weight of the piece pulls firmly against his tired muscles. It is not just the physical density of the gold and the Brazilian rosewood, but the immense, invisible weight of the political expectations tied permanently to this glittering gift. Holding the heavy scabbard firmly in his left hand, he rests his right thumb against the gold-mounted throat. With a slow, steady pull, he slides the Solingen steel blade just an inch out of its velvet-lined sanctuary. The sound is a quiet metallic breath, a remarkably smooth friction of polished steel gliding against woven silk. The warm amber candlelight instantly catches the frosted, dark grey valleys of the acid-etched blade. The majestic wings of the American eagle and the curling edges of the oak leaves are revealed in absolute pristine detail, a beautiful, abstract romanticization of the very conflict that keeps him awake in the deep hours of the night. He looks closely at the immaculate, imported steel. He knows the true, bitter smell of burning black powder, the biting cold of the autumn rains, and the deafening, chaotic roar of the front lines. Yet this blade knows nothing of those harsh truths. It knows only the fragrant scent of melted beeswax, the quiet tapping of a jeweller's hammer, and the soft embrace of dark velvet. It is a stunning, flawless illusion, a physical manifestation of glory, created by men who will never have to witness the heavy cost of that glory firsthand. He slides the blade smoothly back into the rosewood scabbard, the gold throat meeting the heavy base of the hilt with a dull, resonant click. The illusion is sealed away once more. He does not smile, nor does he celebrate the overwhelming fortune resting in his hands. He simply holds it in the quiet shadows of the study, a solitary man bearing the immense burden of command, reflecting on the profound, silent gap between the beautiful art of the jeweller and the solemn, unyielding reality of the era. He takes a long, slow breath, letting the heavy silence of the room wrap around him like a thick woolen coat, finding a fleeting moment of peace in the quiet isolation. The heavy rosewood presentation case rests patiently on the green leather of the desk, its midnight blue velvet interior waiting in the warm shadows. The general slowly lowers the immense weight of the completed sword back into its perfectly moulded cradle. As the thick gold and polished rosewood settle deeply into the plush fabric, the velvet exhales a tiny, almost imperceptible breath of trapped air, carrying the faint, luxurious scent of crushed silk and dry cedar wood up into the quiet atmosphere of the private study. He runs his rough, weathered thumb along the heavy gold throat of the scabbard one last time. The precious metal has already begun to cool, rapidly losing the temporary warmth of his touch, returning to its natural, indifferent state. The 100 rose-cut diamonds on the hilt flash one final time in the amber candlelight, throwing tiny, fragmented rainbows against the dark, gold-embossed spines of the leather-bound books lining the walls. They are breathtakingly beautiful, but they offer no tactical advantage, no shelter from the coming winter winds, and no comfort to the tired men sleeping on the hardening earth of the front lines. They are simply cold light trapped in ancient stone, a silent monument to the wealth of the northern cities. With a profound sense of quiet resignation, he reaches for the thick lid of the rosewood case. He pulls it slowly downward, the solid brass hinges operating in absolute frictionless silence. The heavy timber lid meets the base with a deep, resonant, and incredibly solid thud, sealing the glittering paradox away in undisturbed darkness. The warm, flickering light of the beeswax candles is instantly cut off from the gold and the gems, leaving them completely blind and cold once more. He presses the 2 solid brass clasps downward, listening to the sharp, satisfying metallic snap as they secure the heavy wooden shell. He inserts the tiny brass key into the center lock and turns it. the internal mechanism engaging with a definitive, heavy click. He places the key carefully into the pocket of his dark wool waistcoat. The artifact is secure. It will sit on this desk, a heavy, beautiful anchor in the quiet room, quietly outlasting him and outlasting the very conflict it was meant to commemorate. He reaches out and gently pinches the wick of the nearest beeswax candle, the tiny flame extinguishing with a soft hiss, leaving a thin, curling ribbon of fragrant grey smoke to slowly drift into the shadows of the silent room. The thin, curling ribbon of fragrant grey smoke slowly dissipates into the high, dark corners of the private study, leaving behind the faint, lingering scent of burnt cotton wick and sweet, melted beeswax. The general stands in the heavy shadows for a long moment, the absolute silence of the room pressing gently against his tired shoulders. He turns away from the massive leather-topped desk, his heavy boots making soft, muffled thuds against the thick Persian rug. He walks toward the heavy mahogany doors, his hand reaching out to grasp the cool brass knob. As he pulls the door open, a brief, muffled wave of the grand reception down the hall washes into the room. A distant murmur of voices, the faint clinking of fine crystal, before he steps through and pulls the heavy door shut behind him. The heavy click of the latch seals the study in profound, undisturbed isolation once again. The rosewood presentation case rests exactly where he left it, a solid, dark monolith occupying the very center of the quiet room. Inside the locked box, the midnight blue velvet holds the golden goddess and her 100 diamonds in a state of absolute, pitch-black suspension. The imported Solingen steel blade slumbers in its dark crimson scabbard, entirely blind to the world, its terrible beauty hidden away beneath layers of wood, silk, and heavy brass. As the deep night slowly reclaims the capital city, the warm amber glow of the remaining candles in the study gradually burns down, their small flames flickering and dying one by one in the still air. The room surrenders entirely to the darkness, save for a pale singular shaft of cold moonlight that manages to slip through a small gap in the heavy velvet drapes. This silver beam inches slowly across the floor, eventually climbing the side of the leather desk and resting perfectly upon the polished brass lock of the presentation case. The only remaining sound in the vast empty room is the slow rhythmic heartbeat of the tall grandfather clock standing deep in the corner. The heavy brass pendulum swings back and forth with a deep, sonorous tick, marking the quiet, relentless passage of time. The glittering artifact, born in the fiery heat of a New York workshop and carried through the freezing autumn rain, has finally found its permanent rest. It waits in the silent dark, a perfect unchanging symbol outlasting the fragile men who forged it, the wealthy men who bought it, and the weary men who held it, resting eternally in the quiet, dusty shadows of history. Decades bleed softly into a century, and the heavy rosewood case slumbers quietly through the shifting tides of history. The grand mahogany desk, the flickering beeswax candles, and the weary generals of a fractured republic are long gone, dissolved into the sepia-toned pages of heavy textbooks. They are replaced by the sterile, perfectly climate-controlled hush of a modern museum archival vault deep beneath the bustling city streets. The resonant ticking of the grandfather clock has faded away, replaced by the constant, practically imperceptible hum of air purification systems working tirelessly to preserve the fragile artifacts of the past. The room is bathed in a soft, even pool of cool artificial light, casting no long shadows and hiding no secrets. A curator walks slowly down the long steel-lined aisle, her footsteps entirely muffled by the thick, rubberized flooring. She stops before a large stainless steel examination table where the dark rosewood case now rests. The wood remains incredibly dense and deeply crimson, wearing its age not as a burden, but as a quiet, polished dignity. The solid brass corners have developed a soft, mellow patina, a visual testament to the countless years spent resting in the undisturbed dark. She raises her hands, carefully pulling on a pair of spotless white cotton archival gloves. The tactile connection to the past is now mediated, respectful, and meticulously clean. She reaches for the two heavy brass clasps. They release with the exact same sharp, satisfying metallic snap they made over a century ago, a mechanical echo of a forgotten era bridging the vast chasm of time. As she lifts the heavy timber lid, a faint, ghostly whisper of crushed silk and dry cedar wood briefly escapes into the sterile air. The golden goddess of liberty is bathed in light once more. The 100 rose-cut diamonds, entirely untouched by time or decay, capture the cool surgical light of the vault and throw it back as brilliant, icy sparks. They are completely indifferent to the changing world above. The curator gazes down at the flawless beauty of the presentation sword, tracing the invisible history of fire and silent labor woven into the gold before leaving the artifact to rest in its quiet, eternal sleep. The curator's white cotton gloves glide softly over the heavy gold hilt, a stark contrast to the soot-stained, calloused hands of the artisan who forged it and the weary, weathered grip of the general who first received it. With practiced, deliberate care, she lifts the presentation sword from its midnight blue velvet cradle. Even after more than a century and a half, the sheer physical density of the weapon is startling. The Brazilian rosewood and pure gold anchor the piece with a profound, unyielding gravity, demanding immediate respect from anyone who holds it in the quiet vault. She rests the scabbard on the soft, non-abrasive foam mat lining the steel examination table. Grasping the golden throat, she gently pulls the hilt. The Solingen steel blade emerges with a quiet metallic sigh, sliding smoothly against the silk interior. The pristine condition of the metal is breathtaking. The deep, acid-etched valleys forming the American eagle and the sweeping oak leaves have not dulled a fraction of a millimeter. They remain as sharp and deliberate as they were on that freezing New York morning in 1862. As she examines the frosty grey steel under the high-intensity magnification ring, the profound irony of the artifact washes over her, just as it had for its creator. This sword, a magnificent emblem of a brutal and bloody conflict, has never tasted the smoke of black powder or the bitter cold of a muddy battlefield. It has survived the turbulent centuries precisely because it was designed for grand parlours and velvet vaults, an abstract, romanticized symbol of war, kept safely away from war's devastating reality. She documents its immaculate condition on a digital tablet, translating the visceral beauty of the rose-cut diamonds and the golden goddess into cold, archival data. It is a necessary process, ensuring the artifact's survival for generations she will never meet. Slowly, she slides the cold steel back into the dark crimson scabbard. The gold mounts meet with a soft, resonant click, sealing the violent illusion away once more. She is simply the latest temporary guardian in a long, quiet lineage, tasked with preserving the timeless, glittering masterpiece in its endless, undisturbed slumber. The heavy rosewood case is left behind in the dark vault as the presentation sword is carefully transferred to its new, highly visible sanctuary. It is laid upon a slanted pedestal covered in stark, museum-grade crimson fabric, encased beneath a thick, impenetrable dome of tempered glass. The soft, flickering amber glow of 19th-century beeswax candles is replaced by the harsh, surgical brilliance of modern fibre-optic lighting. As the grand exhibition hall opens to the public, the cold, direct beams of light strike the 100 rose-cut diamonds, instantly igniting them into a blinding, prismatic explosion of white fire that commands the immediate attention of everyone who enters the vast room. A continuous, slow-moving river of faces passes by the glass display case throughout the day. School children stare with wide, unblinking eyes at the golden goddess of liberty, their imaginations instantly captured by the tangible, overwhelming display of ancient wealth. Adults lean closely against the heavy brass railing, reading the small, sanitized informational placard that describes the piece merely as a magnificent presentation sword, circa 1862. They whisper in hushed, reverent tones about the staggering monetary value of the pure gold and the remarkable clarity of the imported stones. To the endless, shifting crowd, the weapon is a pristine symbol of absolute glory and undeniable national triumph. Yet, safely sealed behind the thick glass, the sword remains entirely silent, holding tightly to its profound, solitary irony. The admiring faces pressing against the display case do not see the freezing, muddy trenches of the distant past, nor do they hear the deafening roar of a fractured nation that birthed the glittering artifact. They do not know of the solitary artisan James, who sacrificed his eyesight and his weary hands in the deep, lonely hours of the night to hammer this very illusion into reality. The sword sits perfectly still under the blinding modern lights, a magnificent, beautiful lie that has successfully fooled the passing generations. It continues to trade the brutal, heavy truths of history for a flawless, diamond-encrusted reflection, remaining completely untouched by the bloody reality it was supposedly created to honor. The relentless stream of museum visitors flows endlessly past the glass case, a constant blur of casual admiration and quick, passing glances. But in the late afternoon, as the ambient noise of the grand exhibition hall begins to settle into a soft, echoing murmur, a single figure remains anchored to the heavy brass railing. He is a young man, a jeweller by trade, his own hands bearing the familiar, faint scars of sharp steel gravers, polishing wheels, and hot metal. He does not look directly at the blinding, prismatic fire of the rose-cut diamonds, nor is he overwhelmed by the sheer, staggering volume of pure gold. Instead, he leans in until his breath almost touches the thick-tempered glass, his eyes narrowing as he focuses intently on the microscopic spaces hidden between the precious stones. Beneath the unforgiving surgical brilliance of the modern fiber optic lighting, he sees exactly what the casual observers entirely miss. He sees the tiny, deliberate beads of gold, painstakingly raised and pushed over the girdle of each diamond to secure it, a technique requiring excruciating patience, failing eyesight, and a perfectly steady hand. He notices the incredibly fine, almost invisible chased lines detailing the individual feathers of the golden eagle, lines that could only have been born from hours of solitary, focused labor in the deep silence of a long night. He recognizes the quiet, enduring fingerprint of a master artisan. In the heavy, brief silence between the passing crowds, a profound, invisible thread stretches across a century and a half, directly connecting the young man in the sterile museum to the weary, soot-stained artisan working alone in a freezing New York workshop. He stands there for a very long time, sharing a silent, deeply intimate conversation with the past. He intimately understands the profound physical toll, the aching joints, and the quiet isolation required to coax such flawless beauty from cold, unyielding materials. For this brief, fleeting moment, the presentation sword is completely stripped of its heavy political irony and its incomprehensible monetary value. It ceases to be a sanitized monument to a fractured republic. Instead, it becomes a pure, enduring testament to the sheer will, the silent suffering, and the unmatched skill of a single human being. James's long, lonely vigil in 1862 has not been entirely swallowed by the unforgiving march of time. His quiet spirit lives on, whispering softly from the polished gold to anyone who truly knows how to listen. The soft, resonant chime of the museum's closing bell echoes gently through the cavernous exhibition hall, a polite but firm signal marking the end of the day. The young jeweller gives the glass case one final, lingering look of profound respect before turning away, his footsteps fading into the distance, along with the rest of the departing crowd. Uniformed guards move slowly through the vast, carpeted aisles, ensuring the space is entirely empty before heavy steel doors are secured with a series of muffled electronic clicks. The grand, bustling space is quickly reduced to an immense, heavy silence, leaving the ancient artifacts alone to face the approaching night. One by one, the harsh, surgical brilliance of the modern fiber optic lights begins to power down. The long rows of display cases plunge sequentially into deep grey shadows. The sudden absence of illumination strips the presentation sword of its blinding, prismatic fire. The 100 rose-cut diamonds, which moments ago held the captivated gaze of hundreds, instantly return to their natural state, cold, unseeing fragments of ancient carbon waiting blindly in the dark. The golden goddess of liberty surrenders her radiant artificial warmth, dissolving seamlessly into the pitch-black void of her glass and steel tomb. The imported Solingen steel blade, still hidden safely within the crimson rosewood scabbard, rests in absolute undisturbed peace. The men who fought and bled in the freezing mud of the distant valleys are long gone. The weary general who first turned the tiny brass key in the warm light of his private study is nothing more than a faded name in a heavy, leather-bound history book. James, the solitary master artisan, who traded his eyesight and the strength of his hands for this flawless illusion, has long since returned to the very earth that yielded the gold he so masterfully shaped. They were all fragile, fleeting sparks in the grand, sweeping timeline of the world, yet the presentation sword remains. It is a stunning, tragic paradox of human creation, an object born from the brutal reality of a fractured nation that will never truly know the terrible touch of battle. It sits perfectly still in the sterile, climate-controlled dark, completely immune to the devastating decay of time and memory. It will outlast the heavy concrete walls of the museum that houses it, just as it quietly outlasted the generation it was built to honor. Resting eternally in its silent slumber, the glittering masterpiece keeps its quiet secrets locked away, a beautiful, cold, and absolutely flawless ghost waiting patiently in the dark.